but closing her mouth when Oliver interrupted with, "Oh, she is." Eloise wasn't about to disparage another adult, especially one who was meant to have some authority over them, so instead, she decided to sidestep the issue by saying, "It doesn't matter this morning, does it, because you have me instead?" Amanda reached out shyly and took her hand. "I like you," she said. "I like you, too," Eloise replied, surprised by the tears forming in the corners of her eyes. Oliver said nothing. Eloise wasn't insulted. It took some people longer to warm up to a person than others. Besides, these children had a right to be wary. Their mother had left them, after all. Granted, it was through death, but they were young, all they would know was that they had loved her and she was gone. Eloise remembered well the months following the death of her father. She had clung to her mother at every opportunity, telling herself that if she just kept her nearby, or even better, holding her hand, then her mother couldn't leave either. Was it any wonder that these children resented their new nursemaid? They had probably been cared for by Nurse Millsby since birth. Losing her so soon after Marina's death must have been doubly difficult. "I'm sorry we blackened your eye," Amanda said. Eloise squeezed her hand. "It looks much worse than it actually is." "It looks dreadful," Oliver admitted, his little face beginning to show signs of remorse. "Yes, it does," Eloise agreed, "but it's starting to grow on me. I think I look rather like a soldier who's been to battle and won." "You don't look like you've won," Oliver said, one corner of his mouth twisting in a dubious expression. "Nonsense. Of course I do. Anyone who actually comes home from battle wins." "Does that mean Uncle George lost?" Amanda asked. "You father's brother?" Amanda nodded. "He died before we were born." Eloise wondered if they knew that their mother was originally to have married him. Probably not. "Your uncle was a hero," she said with quiet respect. "But not father," Oliver said. "Your father couldn't go to war because he had too many responsibilities here," Eloise explained. "But this is a very serious conversation for such a fine morning, don't you think? We should be out swimming and having a grand time." The twins quickly caught her enthusiasm, and in no time they were changed into their bathing costumes and headed across the fields to the lake. "We must practice our arithmetic," Eloise called out as they skipped ahead. And much to her surprise, they actually did. Who would have known that 6s and 8s could be so much fun? Chapter 8. How fortunate you are to be at school. We girls have been presented with a new governess, and she is misery personified. She drones on about sums from dawn until dusk. Poor Hyacinth now breaks into tears every time she hears the word 7. Although I must confess that I don't understand why 1 through 6 do not elicit similar reactions. I don't know what we shall do. Dip her hair in ink, I suppose. Miss Havershams, that is, not Hyacinth's, although I would never rule out the latter. From Eloise Bridgerton to her brother Gregory, during his first term as a student at Eton. When Philip returned from the Rose Garden, he was surprised to find his home quiet and empty. It was a rare day when the air wasn't exploding with the sound of some overturned table or shriek of outrage. The children, he thought, pausing to savor the silence. Clearly, they had been vacated from the premises. Nurse Edwards must have taken them out for a walk. And, he supposed, Eloise would still be abed, although in truth it was already nearly 10, and she did not seem the sort to laze the day away under her covers. Philip stared down at the roses in his hand. He'd spent an hour choosing exactly the right ones. Romney Hall boasted 3 rose gardens, and he'd had to go to the far one to find the early blooming varieties. He'd then painstakingly picked them, careful to snip at the exact right spot so as to encourage further blooming, and then meticulously sliced away each thorn. Flowers he could do. Green plants he could do even better, but somehow he didn't think Eloise would find much romance in a fistful of ivy. He wandered over to the breakfast room, expecting to see food laid out, awaiting Eloise's arrival, but the sideboard was tidy and spotless, signaling that the morning meal had come to an end. Philip frowned and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, trying to figure out what he ought to do next. Eloise had obviously already arisen and eaten breakfast, but deuced if he knew where she was. Just then a maid came through, holding a feather duster and a rag. She bobbed a quick curtsy when she saw him. "I'll need a vase for these," he said, holding up the flowers. He'd hoped to hand them to Eloise directly, but he didn't feel like clutching them all morning while he hunted her down. The maid nodded and started to leave, but he stopped her with, "Oh, and do you happen to know where Miss Bridgerton might have gone off to? I noticed that breakfast has been cleared." "Out, Sir Philip," the maid said. "With the children." Philip blinked in surprise. "She went out with Oliver and Amanda?" "Willingly?" The maid nodded. "That's interesting." He sighed, trying not to envision the scene. "I hope they don't kill her." The maid looked alarmed. "Sir Philip?" "It was a joke, ah. Mary?" He didn't mean to finish his sentence on a questioning note, but the truth was, he wasn't quite certain of her name. She nodded in such a way that he couldn't be sure whether he'd gotten it right or she was just being polite. "Do you happen to know where they went?" he asked. "Down to the lake, I believe. To go swimming." Philip's skin went cold. "Swimming?" he asked, his voice sounding disembodied and hollow to his ears. "Yes." The children were wearing their bathing costumes. "Swimming? Dear God." For a year now, he'd avoided the lake, always taken the long route around, just to spare himself the sight of it, and he had forbidden the children from ever visiting the site. Or had he? He'd told Nurse Millsby not to allow them near the water, but had he remembered to do the same with Nurse Edwards? He took off at a run, leaving the floor littered with roses. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Last one in is a hermit crab. Oliver shrieked, tearing into the water at top speed, only to laugh when it reached his waist and he was forced to slow down. "I'm not a hermit crab." "You're a hermit crab." Amanda yelled back as she splashed around in the shallower depths. "You're a rotten hermit crab." "Well, you're a dead hermit crab." Eloise laughed as she waded through the water a few yards away from Amanda. She hadn't brought a bathing costume. Indeed, who would have thought she might need one? So she had tied her skirt and petticoat up, baring her legs to just above her knees. It was an awful lot of leg to be showing, but that hardly mattered in the company of two 8-year-olds. Besides, they were having far too much fun tormenting each other to give her legs even a passing glance. The twins had warmed up to her during their walk down to the lake, laughing and chattering the entire way, and Eloise wondered if all they truly needed was a bit of attention. They'd lost their mother, their relationship with their father was distant at best, and then their beloved nurse had left them. Thank heavens they had each other. And maybe, perhaps, her. Eloise bit her lip, not sure whether she ought even to be allowing her thoughts to veer in that direction. She hadn't yet decided whether she wanted to marry Sir Philip, and much as these two children seemed to need her, and they did need her, she just knew they did. She couldn't make her decision based on Oliver and Amanda. She wasn't going to be marrying them. "Don't go any deeper," she called out, mindful that Oliver had been inching away. He pulled the sort of face boys do when they think they are being mollycoddled, but she noticed that he took 2 large steps back toward the shore. "You should come in further, Miss Bridgerton," Amanda said, sitting down on the lake bottom and then squealing, "Oh. It's cold." "Why did you sit down, then?" Oliver said. "You knew how cold it was." "Yes, but my feet were used to it," she replied, hugging her arms to her body. It didn't feel so cold anymore. "Don't worry," he told her with a supercilious grin, "your bottom will get used to it soon, too." "Oliver," Eloise said sternly, but she was fairly certain she'd ruined the effect by smiling. "He's right," Amanda exclaimed, turning to Eloise with an expression of surprise. "I can't feel my bottom at all anymore." "I'm not so sure that's a good thing," Eloise said. "You should swim," Oliver prodded, "or at least go as far as Amanda. You've barely got your feet wet." I don't have a bathing costume, Eloise said, even though she'd explained this to them at least 6 times already. I think you don't know how to swim, he said. I assure you I know very well how to swim, she returned, and that you're not likely to provoke a demonstration while I'm wearing my third best morning dress. Amanda looked over at her and blinked a few times. I should like to see your first and second best. That's a very pretty frock. Why, thank you, Amanda, Eloise said, wondering who picked out the young girl's clothing. The crotchety Nurse Edwards, probably. There was nothing wrong with what Amanda was wearing, but Eloise would wager that no one had ever thought to offer her the fun of choosing her own garments. She smiled at Amanda and said, if you would like to go shopping sometime, I would be happy to take you. Oh, I should adore that, Amanda said breathlessly. Above all else. Thank you. Girls, Oliver said disdainfully. You'll be glad for us someday, Eloise remarked. Eh? She just shook her head with a smile. It would be some time before he thought girls were good for anything other than tying their plaits together. Oliver just shrugged and went back to hitting the surface of the water with the heel of his hand at just the right angle so as to splash the maximum amount of water on his sister. Stop it! Amanda hollered. He cackled and splashed some more. Oliver! Amanda stood up and advanced menacingly toward him. Then, when walking proved too slow, she dove in and began to swim. He shrieked with laughter and swam away, coming up for air only long enough to taunt her. I'll get you yet. Amanda growled, stopping for a moment to tread water. Don't go too far out. Eloise called, but it really wasn't very important. It was clear that both children were excellent swimmers. If they were like Eloise and her siblings, they'd probably been swimming since age 4. The Bridgerton children had spent countless summer hours splashing around in the pond near their home in Kent, although, in truth, the swimming had been curtailed after the death of their father. When Edmund Bridgerton had been alive, the family had spent most of their time in the country, but once he was gone, they had found themselves in town more often than not. Eloise had never known if it was because her mother preferred town or simply that their home in the country held too many memories. Eloise adored London and had certainly enjoyed her time there, but now that she was here in Gloucestershire, splashing in a pond with 2 boisterous young children, she realized how much she'd missed the country way of living. Not that she was prepared to give up London and all the friends and amusements it offered, but still, she was beginning to think she didn't need to spend quite so much time in the capital. Amanda finally caught up with her brother and launched herself on top of him, causing them both to go under. Eloise watched carefully. She could see a hand or foot break the surface every few seconds until they both came up for air, laughing and gasping and vowing to beat each other in what was clearly extremely important warfare. Be careful. Eloise called out, mostly because she felt she should. It was strange to find herself in the position of authoritative adult. With her nieces and nephews she got to be the fun and permissive aunt. Oliver! Do not pull your sister's hair. He stopped but then immediately moved to the collar of her bathing costume, which could not have been comfortable for Amanda, and indeed, she began to sputter and cough. Oliver! Eloise yelled. Stop that at once. He did, which surprised and pleased her. But Amanda used the momentary reprieve to jump on top of him, sending him under while she sat on his back. Amanda! Eloise yelled. Amanda pretended not to hear. Oh, blast, now she was going to have to wait out there to put an end to it herself, and she was going to be completely soaked in the process. Amanda, stop that this instant, she called out, making one last attempt to save her dress and her dignity. Amanda did, and Oliver came up gasping, Amanda Crane, I'm going to. No, you're not, Eloise said sternly. Neither one of you is going to kill, maim, attack, or even hug the other for at least 30 minutes. They were clearly appalled that Eloise had even mentioned the possibility of a hug. Well? Eloise demanded. They were completely silent, then Amanda asked, then what will we do? Good question. Most of Eloise's own memories of swimming involved the same sort of war games. Maybe we'll dry off. And rest for a spell, she said. They both looked horrified by the suggestion. We certainly ought to work on lessons, Eloise added. Perhaps a bit more arithmetic. I did promise Nurse Edwards that we would do something constructive with our time. That suggestion went over about as well as the first. Very well, Eloise said. What do you suggest we do? I don't know, came Oliver's muttered reply, punctuated by Amanda's shoulder shrug. Well, there is certainly no point in standing here doing nothing, Eloise said, planting her hands on her hips. Aside from the fact that it's exceedingly boring, we're likely to get out of the lake. Eloise whirled around, so surprised by the furious roar that she slipped and fell in the water. Drat and blast, there went her dry intentions and her dress. Sir Philip, she gasped, thankful that she'd broken her fall with her hands and had not landed on her bottom. Still, the front of her dress was completely soaked. Get out of the water, Philip growled, striding into the lake with astonishing force and speed. Sir Philip, Eloise said, her voice cracking with surprise as she staggered to her feet, what? But he had already grabbed both of his children, his arms wrapped around each of their rib cages, and was hauling them to shore. Eloise watched with fascinated horror as he set them none too gently down on the grass. I told you never, ever to go near the lake, he yelled, shaking each by a shoulder. You know you're supposed to stay away. You. He stopped, clearly shaken by something, and by the need to catch his breath. But that was last year, Oliver whimpered. Did you hear me rescind the order? No, but I thought. You thought wrong, Philip snapped. Now get back to the house. Both of you. The two children recognized the deadly serious intent in their father's eyes and quickly fled up the hill. Philip did nothing as they left, just watched them run, and then, as soon as they were out of earshot, he turned to Eloise with an expression that caused her to take a step back and said, What the hell did you think you were doing? For a moment she could say nothing, his question seemed too ludicrous for a reply. Having a spot of fun, she finally said, probably with a bit more insolence than she ought. I do not want my children near the lake, he bit off. I have made those wishes clear. Not to me. Well, you should have. How was I meant to know that you wanted them to stay away from the water, she asked, interrupting him before he could accuse her of irresponsibility or whatever it was he was going to say. I told their nurse where we intended to go, and what we intended to do, and she gave no indication that it was forbidden. She could see from his face that he knew he had no valid argument, and it was making him all the more furious. Men. The day they learned to admit to a mistake was the day they became women. It's a hot day, she continued, her voice clipping along in the way it always did when she was determined not to lose an argument. Which, for Eloise, generally meant any argument. I was trying to mend the breach, she added, since I don't particularly relish the thought of another blackened eye. She said it to make him feel guilty, and it must have worked, since his cheeks turned ruddy and he muttered something that might have been an assurance under his breath. Eloise paused for a few seconds to see if he would say more, or, even better, say something with a tone that approached intelligible speech, but when he did nothing but glare at her, she continued with, I thought that doing something fun might go a long way. Heaven knows, she muttered, the children could use a spot of fun. What are you saying? He asked, his voice angry and low. Nothing, she said quickly. Just that I didn't see any harm in going swimming. You put them in danger. Danger? She sputtered. From swimming? Philip said nothing, just glared at her. Oh, for heaven's sake, she said dismissively, it would only have been dangerous if I couldn't swim. I don't care if you can swim, he bit off. I only care that my children can't. She blinked several times. Yes, they can, she said. In fact, they're both quite proficient. I'd assumed you'd taught them. What are you talking about? Her head tilted slightly, perhaps out of concern, perhaps out of curiosity. Didn't you know they could swim? For a moment, Philip felt as if he couldn't breathe. His lungs tightened and his skin prickled, and his body seemed to freeze into a hard, cold statue. It was awful. He was awful. Somehow this moment seemed to crystallize all of his failings. It wasn't that his children could swim, it was that he hadn't known they could swim. How could a father not know such a thing about his own children? A father ought to know if his children could ride a horse. He ought to know if they could read and count to 100. And for the love of God, he ought to know if they could swim. He said, his voice giving out after a single word. She took a step forward, whispering, "Are you all right?" He nodded, or at least he thought he nodded. Her voice was ringing in his head, yes, they can, and it didn't even matter what she was saying. It had been the tone. Surprise, and maybe even a hint of disdain. And he hadn't known. His children were growing and changing, and he didn't know them. He saw them, he recognized them, but he didn't know who they were. He felt himself take a gasp of air. He didn't know what their favorite colors were. Pink? Blue? Green? Did it matter, or did it only matter that he didn't know? He was, in his own way, every bit as awful a father as his own had been. Thomas Crane may have beaten his children too, within an inch of their lives, but at least he knew what they were up to. Philip ignored and avoided and pretended anything, to keep his distance and avoid losing his temper. Anything to stop him from becoming his father all over again. Except maybe distance wasn't always such a good thing. "Philip?" Eloise whispered, laying a hand on his arm. "Is something the matter?" He stared at her, but he still felt blinded, and his eyes couldn't seem to focus. "I think you should go home," she said, slowly and carefully. "You don't look well." He meant to say I'm fine, but the words didn't quite come out. Because he wasn't fine, and he wasn't good, and these days he wasn't even sure what he was. Eloise chewed on her lower lip, then hugged her arms to her chest and glanced up at the sky as a shadow passed over her. Philip followed her gaze, watched as a cloud slid over the sun, dropping the temperature of the air at least 10 degrees. He looked at Eloise, his breath catching in his throat as she shivered. Philip felt colder than he ever had in his life. "You need to get inside," he said, grabbing her arm and attempting to haul her up the hill. "Philip," she yelped, stumbling along behind him. "I'm fine, just a little chilled." He touched her skin. "You're not just a little chilled, you're bloody well freezing." He yanked off his coat. "Put this on." Eloise didn't argue, but she did say, "Truly, I'm fine. There is no need to run." The last word came out halfway strangled as he yanked her forward, nearly off her feet. "Philip, stop," she yelped. "Please, just let me walk." He halted so quickly that she stumbled, whirling around and hissing, "I will not be responsible for your freezing yourself into a lung fever." "But it's May." "I don't care if it's bloody July. You will not remain in those wet clothes." "Of course not," Eloise replied, trying to sound reasonable, since it was quite clear that argument was simply going to make him dig his heels in even further. "But there is no reason I cannot walk. It's only 10 minutes back to the house. I'm not going to die." She hadn't thought that blood could literally drain from a person's face, but she had no idea how else to describe the sudden blanching of his skin. "Philip?" she asked, growing alarmed. "What is wrong?" For a moment she didn't think he was going to answer, and then, almost as if he weren't aware that he was making a noise, he whispered, "I don't know." She touched his arm and gazed up at his face. He looked confused, almost dazed, as if he'd been dropped into a theatrical play and didn't know his lines. His eyes were open, and they were on her, but she didn't think he saw anything, just a memory of something that must have been very awful indeed. Her heart broke for him. She knew bad memories, knew how they could squeeze a heart and haunt one's dreams until one was afraid to blow out the candle. Eloise had, at the age of 7, watched her father die, shrieked and sobbed as he'd gasped for air and collapsed to the ground, then beaten against his chest when he could no longer speak, begging him to wake up and say something. It was obvious now that he'd already been dead by that point, but somehow that made the memory even worse. But Eloise had managed to put that behind her. She didn't know how. It was probably all due to her mother, who had come to her side every night and held her hand and told her it was all right to talk about her father. And it was all right to miss him. Eloise still remembered, but it no longer haunted her, and she hadn't had a nightmare in over a decade. But Philip, his was a different story. Whatever had happened to him in the past, it was still very much with him. And unlike Eloise, he was facing it alone. "Philip," she said, touching his cheek. He didn't move, and if she hadn't felt his breath on her fingers, she would have sworn he was a statue. She said his name again, stepping even closer. She wanted to erase that shattered look from his eyes, she wanted to heal him. She wanted to make him the person she knew he was, deep down in his heart. She whispered his name one last time, offering him compassion and understanding and the promise of help, all in one single word. She hoped he heard, she hoped he listened. And then, slowly, his hand covered hers. His skin was warm and rough, and he pressed her hand against his cheek, as if he were trying to sear her touch into his memory. Then he moved her hand to his mouth and kissed her palm, intensely, almost reverently, before sliding it down to his chest, across his beating heart. "Philip," she whispered, question in her voice even though she knew what he intended to do. His free hand found the small of her back, and he pulled her to him, slowly but surely, with a firmness she could not deny. And then he touched her chin and tilted her face to his, stopping only to whisper her name before capturing her mouth in a kiss that was blinding in its intensity. He was hungry, needy, and he kissed her as if he would die without her, as if she were his very food, his air, his body and soul. It was the type of kiss a woman could never forget, the sort Eloise had never even dreamed possible. He pulled her even closer, until the entire length of her body was pressed up against his. One of his hands traveled down her back to her bottom, cupping her, pulling her against him until she gasped at the intimacy of it. "I need you," he groaned, the words sounding as if they were ripped from his throat. His lips slid off her mouth to her cheek, then down her neck, teasing and tickling as they went. She was melting. He was melting her, until she didn't know who she was or what she was doing. All she wanted was him. More of him. All of him. Except not like this. Not when he was using her like some sort of sucker to heal his wounds. "Philip," she said, somehow finding the strength to pull back. "We can't. Not like this." For a moment she didn't think he would let her go, but then, abruptly, he did. "I'm sorry," he said, breathing hard. He looked dazed, and she didn't know if that was from the kiss or simply from the tumultuous events of the morning. "Don't apologize," she said, instinctively smoothing her skirts, only to find them wet and unsmoothable. But she ran her hands along them anyway, feeling nervous and uncomfortable in her own body. If she didn't move, didn't force herself into some sort of meaningless motion, she was afraid she would launch herself back into his arms. "You should go back to the house," he said, his voice still low and hoarse. She felt her eyes widen with surprise. "Aren't you coming as well?" He shook his head and said in an oddly flat voice, "You won't freeze. It's May, after all." "Well, yes, but..." She let her words trail off, since she didn't really know what to say. She supposed she'd been hoping he'd interrupt her. She turned to walk up the hill, then stopped when she heard his voice, quiet and intent, behind her. "I need to think," he said. "About what?" She shouldn't have asked, shouldn't have intruded, but she'd never been able to mind her own business. "I don't know." He shrugged helplessly. "Everything, I suppose." Eloise nodded and continued back to the house. But the bleak look in his eyes haunted her all day. Chapter 9. We all miss father, especially this time of year. But think how lucky you were to have had 18 years with him. I remember so little, and I do wish he could have known me, and all that I've grown up to be. From Elise Bridgerton to her brother Viscount Bridgerton upon the occasion of the 10th anniversary of their father's death. Eloise was purposefully late for supper that evening. Not by much, it was not in her nature to be tardy, especially since it was a trait she didn't care to tolerate in others. But after the events of that afternoon, she had no idea if Sir Philip was even going to show up for supper, and she couldn't bear the thought of waiting in the drawing-room, trying not to twiddle her thumbs as she wondered if she was to dine alone. At precisely 10 minutes past 7, she reckoned she could assume that if he wasn't waiting for her, he wasn't joining her, and she could then proceed to the dining room on her own and act as if she'd planned to eat by herself all the while. But much to her surprise, and, if she was honest, her great relief as well, Philip was standing by the window when she entered the drawing-room, elegantly dressed in evening kit that was, if not the very latest in style, obviously well made and tailored to perfection. Eloise noticed that his attire was strictly black and white, and she wondered if he was still in partial mourning for Marina, or if perhaps that was simply his preference. Her brothers rarely wore the peacock colors that were so popular among a certain set of the ton, and Sir Philip didn't seem the type either. Eloise stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at his profile, wondering if he'd even seen her. And then he turned, murmured her name, and crossed the room. "I hope you will accept my apologies for this afternoon," he said, and although his voice was reserved, she could see the entreaty in his eyes, sense that her forgiveness was very much desired. "No apology is necessary," she said quickly, and it was the truth, she supposed. How could she know if he should apologize when she didn't even understand what had transpired? "It is," he said haltingly. "I overreacted." She said nothing, just watched his face as he cleared his throat. He opened his mouth, but it was several seconds before he said, "Marina nearly drowned in that lake." Eloise gasped, not realizing that her hand had flown up to cover her mouth until she felt her fingers on her lips. "She wasn't a strong swimmer," he explained. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Were you how to ask it without appearing morbidly curious?" There was no way to avoid it, and she couldn't help herself, she had to know. "Were you there?" He nodded grimly. "I pulled her out." "How lucky for her," Eloise murmured. "She must have been terrified." Philip said nothing. He didn't even nod. She thought about her father, thought about how helpless she had felt when he'd collapsed to the ground in front of her. Even as a child, she'd been the sort who needed to do things. She'd never been one of life's observers, she'd always wanted to take action, to fix things, to fix people, even. And the one time it had all truly mattered, she'd been impotent. "I'm glad you were able to save her," she murmured. "It would have been horrible for you if you hadn't." He looked at her oddly, and she realized how strange her words had been, so she added, "It's very difficult when someone dies, and you can only watch, and you can't do anything to stop it." And then, because the moment seemed to call for it, and she felt oddly connected to this man standing so quiet and stiff in front of her, she said softly, and perhaps a bit mournfully as well, "I know." He looked up at her, the question clearly in his eyes. "My father," she said simply. It wasn't something she shared with many people. In fact, her good friend Penelope was probably the only person outside her immediate family who knew that Eloise had been the sole witness to her father's strange and untimely death. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Yes," she said wistfully, "so am I." And then he said the oddest thing. "I didn't know my children could swim." It was so unexpected, such a complete non sequitur, that it was all she could do to blink and say, "I beg your pardon?" He held out his arm to lead her to the dining room. "I didn't know they could swim," he repeated, his voice bleak. "I don't even know who taught them." "Does it matter?" Eloise asked softly. "It does," he said bitterly, "because I should have done so." It was difficult to look at his face. She couldn't recall ever seeing a man so pained, and yet in an odd way it warmed her heart. Anyone who cared so much for his children, even if he didn't quite know how to act around them well, he had to be a good man. Eloise knew that she tended to see the world in blacks and whites, that she sometimes leapt to judgment because she didn't stop to analyze the gradations of gray, but of this she was certain. Sir Philip Crane was a good man. He might not be perfect, but he was good, and his heart was true. Well, she said briskly, since that was her manner, and she preferred to deal with problems by charging ahead and fixing them rather than stopping to lament, there's nothing to be done about it now. They can't very well unlearn what they already know. He stopped, looked at her. You're right, of course. And then, more softly, but no matter who did the teaching, I should have known they were able. Eloise agreed with him, but he was so obviously distressed, a scolding seemed inappropriate, not to mention unfeeling. You still have time, you know, she said softly. What, he said, his mocking tone turned upon himself, to teach them the backstroke so that they might expand their repertoire? Well, yes, she said, her tone slightly sharp, since she'd never had much patience for self-pity, but also to learn other things about them. They're charming children. He looked at her dubiously. She cleared her throat. They do misbehave on occasion. One of his brows shot up. Very well, they misbehave quite often, but truly, all they want is a little attention from you. They told you this? Of course not, she said, smiling at his naivete. They're only 8. They're not going to say it in so many words. But it's quite clear to me. They reached the dining room, so Eloise took the seat held out for her by a footman. Philip sat across from her, put his hand on his wineglass, men drew it back. His lips moved, but very slightly, as if he had something to say but wasn't quite certain how to phrase it. Finally, after Eloise had taken a sip of her own wine, he asked, did they enjoy it? Swimming, I mean. She smiled. Very much. You should take them. He closed his eyes and held them that way, not for very long, but still, more than a blink. I don't think I'd be able, he said. She nodded. She knew the power of memories. Perhaps somewhere else, she suggested. Surely there must be another lake nearby. Or even a mere pond. He waited for her to pick up her spoon, then dipped his own in his soup. That's a fine idea. I think. He stopped, cleared his throat. I think I could do that. I shall ponder where we might go. There was something so heartbreaking about his expression, the uncertainty, the vulnerability, the awareness that even though he wasn't sure he was doing the right thing, he was going to try to do it anyway. Eloise felt her heart lurch, skip a beat, even, and she wanted to reach across the table and touch his hand. But of course she couldn't. Even if the table weren't a foot longer than the length of her arm, she couldn't. So in the end, she just smiled and hoped that her manner was reassuring. Philip ate a bit of his soup, then dabbed at his mouth with his napkin and said, I hope that you will join us. Of course, Eloise said, delighted. I would be desolate if I weren't invited. I'm quite certain you overstate, he said with a wry twist to his lips, but nonetheless, we would be honored. And to be quite honest, I would be relieved to have you there. At her curious expression, he added, the outing is certain to be a successful one with your presence. I'm sure you. He stopped her mid-sentence. We will all enjoy ourselves much better with your accompaniment, he said quite emphatically, and Eloise decided to stop arguing and graciously accept the compliment. He was, in all likelihood, correct. He and his children were so unused to spending time together that they would probably benefit from having Eloise along to smooth the way. Eloise found she didn't mind the idea one bit. Perhaps tomorrow, she suggested, if the fine weather holds out. I think it will, Philip said conversationally. The air didn't feel changeable. Eloise glanced at him as she sipped her soup, a chicken broth with bits of vegetables that needed a touch more salt. Do you predict the weather, then? She asked, quite certain her skepticism showed on her face. She had a cousin who was convinced he could predict the weather, and every time she listened to him, she ended up soaked to the skin or freezing her toes off. Not at all, he replied, but one can. He stopped, craned his neck a bit. What was that? What was what? Eloise answered, but as the words left her lips, she heard what Philip must have heard. Argumentative voices, growing louder by the second. Heavy footfall. A forceful stream of invective was followed by a yelp of terror that could only have come from the butler. And then Eloise knew. "Oh, dear God," she said, her grip on her spoon growing slack until the soup dribbled off, splashing back into her bowl. "What the devil?" Philip asked, standing up, obviously preparing to defend his home against invasion, except that he had no idea what sort of invaders he was about to face. What sort of annoying, meddlesome, and diabolical invaders he was going to have to meet in, approximately 10 seconds. But Eloise did. And she knew that annoying, meddlesome, and diabolical meant nothing compared to furious, unreasonable, and downright large when it came to Philip's imminent safety. "Eloise?" Philip asked, his brows shooting up when they both heard someone bellow her name. She felt the blood drain from her body. Positively felt it, knew it had happened, even though she couldn't see it pooling about her feet. There was no way she could survive a moment such as this, no way she could make it through without killing someone, preferably someone to whom she was quite closely related. She stood, her fingers gripping the table. The footsteps, which, to be honest, sounded rather like a rabid horde, grew closer. "Someone you know?" Philip asked, quite mildly, for someone who was about to face his demise. She nodded, and somehow managed to eke out the words, "My brothers." It occurred to Philip, as he was pinned up against the wall, with 2 sets of hands around his throat, that Eloise might have given him a bit more warning. He didn't need days, although that would have been nice, if still insufficient against the collective strength of 4 very large, very angry, and, from the looks of them, rather closely related men. Brothers. He should have considered that. It was probably best to avoid courting a woman with brothers. 4 of them, to be precise. 4. It was a wonder he wasn't dead already. "Anthony!" Eloise shrieked, "Stop!" Anthony, or at least Philip presumed he was Anthony. They hadn't exactly bothered to go through the necessary introductions, tightened his grip on Philip's neck. "Benedict," Eloise pleaded, turning her attention to the largest of the lot. "Be reasonable." The other one squeezing his throat. There were 2 others, but they were just standing around glowering, loosened his grip slightly to turn around and look at Eloise. Which was a huge mistake, since, in their haste to rip every limb from his body, none of them had yet looked at her long enough to see that she sported a nasty blackened eye. Which of course they would think he was responsible for. Benedict let out an unholy growl and jammed Philip against the wall so tightly that his feet came off the ground. Wonderful, Philip thought. Now I really am going to die. The first squeeze was merely uncomfortable, but this. "Stop!" Eloise yelled, hurling herself onto Benedict's back and yanking his hair. Benedict howled as his head jerked backward, but unfortunately Anthony's strangulatory grip held firm, even as Benedict was forced to let go to fight off Eloise. Who was, Philip noted as well as he could, given his lack of oxygen, fighting like a fury, crossed with a banshee, crossed with Medusa herself. Her right hand was still pulling out Benedict's hair, even as her left arm wrapped around his throat, with her forearm lodged quite neatly up under his chin. "Good Christ," Benedict cursed, whirling around as he tried to dislodge his sister. "Someone get her off of me." Not surprisingly, none of the other Bridgertons rushed to his aid. In fact, the one back against the wall looked rather amused by the whole thing. Philip's vision began to curl and turn black at the edges, but he couldn't help but admire Eloise's fortitude. It was a rare woman who knew how to fight to win. Anthony's face suddenly appeared very close to his. "Did you hit her?" he growled. As if he could speak, Philip thought woozily. "No." Eloise cried out, momentarily taking her attention off tearing Benedict's hair out. "Of course he didn't hit me." Anthony looked over at her with a sharp expression as she resumed pummeling Benedict. "There's no of course about it. It was an accident," she insisted. "He had nothing to do with it." And then, when none of her brothers made any indication that they believed her, she added, "Oh, for heaven's sake. Do you really think that I would defend someone who'd struck me?" That seemed to do the trick, and Anthony abruptly let go of Philip, who promptly sagged to the floor, gasping for breath. 4 of them. Had she told him she had 4 brothers? Surely not, he would never have considered marriage to a woman with 4 brothers. Only a fool would shackle himself to such a family. What did you do to him? Eloise demanded, jumping off Benedict and hurrying to Philip's side. What did he do to you? One of the other brothers demanded. The one who, Philip realized, had punched him in the chin right before the others had decided to strangle him instead. She shot him a scathing look. What are you doing here? Protecting my sister's honor, he shot back. As if I need protection from you. You're not even 20, thought Philip, he must be the one whose name began with G. George? No, that wasn't right. Gavin? No. I'm 23, the young one bit off, with all the irritability of a younger sibling. And I'm 28, she snapped. I didn't need your help when you were in nappies, and I don't need it now. Gregory. That's right. Gregory. She'd said as much in one of her letters. Ah, damn. If he knew that, then he must have known about the flock of brothers. He really had no one to blame but himself. He wanted to come along, said the one in the corner, the only one who hadn't yet tried to kill Philip. Philip decided he liked this one best, especially when he wrapped his hand around Gregory's forearm to prevent the younger man from launching himself at Eloise. Which, Philip thought, feeling rather ironically minded there on the floor, was nothing more than she deserved. Nappies, indeed. Well, you should have stopped him, Eloise said, oblivious to Philip's mental defection. Do you have any idea how mortifying this is? Her brothers stared at her, quite rightly, in Philip's opinion, as if she'd gone mad. You lost the right, Anthony bit off, to feel mortified, embarrassed, chagrined, or in fact any emotion other than blindingly stupid when you ran off without a word. Eloise looked a bit mollified but still muttered, it's not as if I would listen to anything he has to say. As opposed to us, the one who had to be Colin murmured, with whom you are the soul of meekness and obeisance. Oh, for the love of God, Eloise said under her breath, sounding rather fetchingly unladylike to Philip's stinging ears. Stinging? Had someone boxed his ears? It was difficult to recall. 4-to-1 odds against did tend to muddle one's memory. You, snapped the one Philip was almost certain was Anthony, with a finger jabbed in Philip's direction, don't go anywhere. As if that were even worth contemplating. And you, Anthony said to Eloise, his voice even deadlier, although Philip wouldn't have thought it possible, what the hell did you think you were doing? Eloise tried to sidestep the question with one of her own. What are you doing here? And succeeded, because her brother actually answered her. Saving you from ruin, he yelled. For the love of God, Eloise, do you have any idea how worried we've been? And here, I thought you hadn't even noticed my departure, she tried to joke. Eloise, he said, mother is beside herself. That sobered her in an instant. Oh, no, she whispered. I didn't think. No, you didn't. Anthony replied, his stern tone exactly what one would expect from a man who'd been the head of his family for 20 years. I ought to take a whip to you. Philip started to intervene, because, really, he couldn't countenance a whipping, but then Anthony added, or at the very least, a muzzle, and Philip decided that brother knew sister very well, indeed. Where do you think you're going? Demanded Benedict, and Philip realized that he must have started to stand before plopping back to his rather impotent position on the floor. Philip looked to Eloise. Perhaps introductions are in order? Oh, Eloise said, gulping. Yes, of course. These are my brothers. I'd gathered, he said, his voice as dry as dust. She shot him an apologetic look, which, Philip thought, was really the least she could do after nearly getting him tortured and killed, then turned to her brothers and motioned to each in turn, saying, Anthony, Benedict, Colin, Gregory. These 3, she added, motioning to A, B, and C, are my elders. This 1 inch she waved dismissively at Gregory is an infant. Gregory looked near ready to throttle her, which suited Philip just fine, since it deflected the murderous intentions off of him. And then Eloise finally turned back to Philip and said to her brothers, Sir Philip Crane, but I expect you know that already. You left a letter in your desk, said Colin. Eloise closed her eyes in agony. Philip thought he saw her lips form the words, stupid, stupid, stupid. Colin smiled grimly. You ought to be more careful in the future, should you decide to run off again. I'll remember that, Eloise shot back, but she was losing her fire. Would now be a good time to stand? Philip inquired, directing his question to no one in particular. No. It was difficult to discern which Bridgerton brother spoke the loudest. Philip remained on the floor. He didn't tend to think himself a coward, and he was, if he did say so himself, quite proficient with his fists, but hell, there were 4 of them. Boxer he might be. Suicidal fool, he was not. How did you get that eye? Colin asked quietly. Eloise paused before answering, it was an accident. He considered her words for a moment. Would you care to expand upon that? Eloise swallowed uncomfortably and glanced down at Philip, which he really wished she wouldn't do. It only made them, as he was coming to think of the quartet, even more convinced that he was the one responsible for her injury, a misapprehension that could only lead to his death and dismemberment. They didn't seem the sorts to allow anyone to lay a hand on their sisters, much less blacken an eye. Just tell them the truth, Eloise, Philip said wearily. It was his children, she said, wincing on the words, but Philip didn't worry. As close as they'd come to strangling him, they didn't seem the sort to harm innocent children. And certainly Eloise would not have said anything if she'd thought it might place Oliver and Amanda in peril. He has children? Anthony asked, eyeing him with a slightly less derogatory expression. Anthony, Philip decided, must be a father as well. 2, Eloise replied. Twins, actually. A boy and a girl. They're 8. My felicitations, Anthony murmured. Thank you, Philip answered, feeling rather old and weary in that moment. Sympathies are probably more to the point. Anthony looked at him curiously, almost, but not quite smiling. They weren't especially keen on my presence here, Eloise said. Smart children, Anthony said. She shot him a decidedly unamused look. They set a tripwire, she said. Rather like the one Colin she turned to spear him with a hostile glare set for me in 1804. Colin's lips twisted into a disbelieving expression. You remember the date? She remembers everything, Benedict commented. Eloise turned to glare at him. Aching throat notwithstanding, Philip was actually beginning to enjoy the interaction. Eloise turned back to Anthony, regal as a queen. I fell, she said simply. On your eye? On my hip, actually, but I didn't have time to break my fall, and I hit my cheek. I imagine the bruising spread to the eye area. Anthony looked down at Philip with a ferocious expression. Is she telling the truth? Philip nodded. On my brother's grave. The children will own up to it as well, should you feel the need to interrogate them. Of course not, Anthony said gruffly. I would never. He cleared his throat, then ordered, stand up. But he tempered his tone by offering Philip his hand. Philip took it, having already decided that Eloise's brother would make a far finer ally than enemy. He eyed the 4 male Bridgertons warily, though, and his stance was defensive. He stood no chance if all 4 decided to charge at him at once, and he wasn't convinced that that was not still a likely possibility. At the end of the day, he was going to find himself either dead or married, and he wasn't quite prepared to let the Bridgerton brothers take the matter to a vote. And then, after Anthony silenced his 4 younger siblings with nothing more than a stare, he turned to Philip and said, perhaps you should tell me what happened. Out of the corner of his eye, Philip saw Eloise open her mouth to interrupt, then close it again, sitting down on a chair with an expression that, if it wasn't meek, was at least meeker than anything he'd ever expected to see gracing her face. Philip decided that he needed to learn how to glare like Anthony Bridgerton. He'd have his children in line in no time. I don't think Eloise will be interrupting us now, Anthony said mildly. Please, go on. Philip glanced over at Eloise. She looked about ready to explode. But still, she held her tongue, which seemed a remarkable feat indeed, for one such as her. Philip briefly recounted the events that had led to Eloise's arrival at Romney Hall. He told Anthony about the letters, beginning with Eloise's letter of condolence, and how they had begun a friendly correspondence, pausing in his story only when Colin shook his head and murmured, "I always wondered what she was writing up in her room." When Philip looked at him quizzically, he held up his hands and added, "Her fingers. They were always ink-stained, and I never knew why." Philip finished his tale, concluding with, "So, as you see, I was looking for a wife. From the tone of her letters, she seemed intelligent and reasonable. My children, as you will come to realize should you remain long enough to meet them, can be rather, he searched for the least unflattering adjective, rambunctious, he said, satisfied with his word choice. I'd been hoping she would be a calming influence on them." "Eloise?" Benedict snorted, and Philip could see from their expressions that the other three brothers agreed with his assessment. And while Philip might smile at Benedict's comment about Eloise remembering everything, and even agree with Anthony about the muzzle, it was becoming apparent that the Bridgerton males did not hold their sister in the regard she deserved. "Your sister," he said, his voice coming off sharp, "has been a marvelous influence upon my children. You would do well not to disparage her in my presence." He'd probably just issued his own death warrant. There were 4 of them, after all, and it wasn't in his best interest to be insulting. But even if they had charged halfway across the country to protect Eloise's virtue, there was no way he was going to stand here and listen to them snort and snuff and make a mockery of her. Not Eloise. Not in front of him. But to his great surprise, not a one of them had a retort, and in fact Anthony, who was still clearly the one in charge, held him with a level stare, assessing him as if he were peeling the layers back until he could see what lay hidden in his core. "We have a great deal to talk about, you and I," Anthony said quietly. Philip nodded. "I expect you will need to speak with your sister as well." Eloise shot him a grateful look. He wasn't surprised. He couldn't imagine she would take well to being left out of any decisions pertaining to her life. Hell, she wasn't the sort to take well to being left out of anything. "Yes," Anthony said, "I do. In fact, I think we shall conduct our interview first, if you don't mind." As if Philip was stupid enough to argue with one Bridgerton while 3 more were glaring at him. "Please use my study," he offered. "Eloise can show you the way." It was the wrong thing to say. None of the brothers cared to be reminded that Eloise had been in residence long enough to know her way around. Anthony and Eloise left the room without another word, leaving Philip alone with the remaining Bridgerton brothers. "Mind if I sit?" Philip asked, since he suspected he was going to be stuck here in the dining room for some time. "Go right ahead," Colin said expansively. Benedict and Gregory just continued to glare. Colin, Philip noted, didn't look particularly eager to strike up a friendship either. He might have been marginally more amiable than his brothers, but his eyes showed a sharp shrewdness that Philip rather thought he ought not underestimate. "Please," Philip said, motioning to the food still on the table, "eat." Benedict and Gregory scowled at him as if he'd offered poison, but Colin sat across from him and plucked a crusty roll off a plate. "They're quite good," Philip said, even though he'd not had the opportunity to partake that evening. "Good," Colin muttered, taking a bite. "I'm famished." "How can you think of food?" Gregory said angrily. "I always think of food," Colin replied, his eyes searching the table until he located the butter. "What else is there?" "Your wife," Benedict drawled. "Ah, yes, my wife," Colin said with a nod. He turned to Philip, leveled a hard stare at him, and said, "Just so that you are aware, I would have rather spent the night with my wife." Philip couldn't think of a reply that might not hint at insult to the absent Mrs. Bridgerton, so he just nodded and buttered a roll of his own. Colin took a huge bite, then spoke with his mouth full, the etiquette breach a clear insult to his host. "We've only been married a few weeks." Philip raised one of his brows in question. "Still newlyweds?" Philip nodded, since some sort of response seemed to be required. Colin leaned forward. I really did not want to leave my wife. I see, Philip murmured, since truly, what else could he have said? Do you understand what he's saying? Gregory demanded. Colin turned and sent a chilling look at his brother, who was clearly too young to have mastered the fine art of nuance and circumspect speech. Philip waited until Colin had turned back to the table, offered him a plate of asparagus, which he took, then said, I gather you miss your wife. There was a beat of silence, and then Colin said, after sending one last disdainful glance at his brother, indeed. Philip looked over at Benedict, since he was the only one uninvolved in the latest spat. Big mistake. Benedict was flexing his hands, still looking as if he regretted not strangling him when he had his chance. Philip then turned his gaze to Gregory, whose arms were crossed angrily over his chest. His entire body practically quivered with fury, perhaps aimed at Philip, perhaps at his family, who'd been treating him like a green boy all evening. Philip's glance was not met with favor. Gregory's chin jutted angrily out, his teeth clenched, and Philip had had enough of that. He looked back to Colin. Colin was still working on his food, having somehow managed to charm the servants into bringing him a bowl of soup. He'd set down his spoon, though, and was presently examining his other hand, idly flexing each finger in turn, murmuring a word as each pointed out toward Philip. Mississippi, my wife. Bloody hell, Philip finally burst out. If you're going to break my legs, would you just go ahead and do it now? Chapter 10. You will never know how unfortunate you are, dearest Penelope, to have sisters only. Brothers are ever so much more fun. From Eloise Bridgerton to Penelope Featherington, following a midnight ride in Hyde Park. With her 3 older brothers. Here are your choices, Anthony said, sitting behind Philip's desk as if he owned the place. You can marry him in 1 week, or you can marry him in 2. Eloise's mouth fell open into a horrified oval. Eloise's mouth fell open into a horrified oval. Anthony. Did you expect me to suggest an alternative? He asked mildly. I suppose we might stretch it to 3, given a sufficiently compelling reason. She hated when he spoke like that, as if he were reasonable and wise, and she were nothing more than a recalcitrant child. It was far better when he ranted and raved. Then, at least, she could pretend he was mad in the head and she was a poor, beleaguered innocent. I don't see why you would object, he continued. Didn't you come here with the intention to marry him? No. I came here with the intention to find out if he was suitable for marriage. And is he? I don't know, she said. It's only been 2 days. And yet, Anthony said, idly examining his fingernails in the dim candlelight, that's still more than enough time to ruin your reputation. Does anyone know I was gone? She quickly asked. Outside the family, that is. Not yet, he admitted, but someone will find out. Someone always finds out. There was supposed to be a chaperone, Eloise said sullenly. Was there? He asked, his voice perfectly conversational, as if he were asking if there was supposed to have been lamb for dinner, or maybe a hunting expedition arranged for his entertainment. She's coming soon. Too bad for her I arrived first, too bad for everyone, Eloise muttered. What was that? He asked, but again he used that awful voice, the one that made it clear he'd heard every word. Anthony, Eloise said, and his name came out like a plea, even though she had no idea what it was she was pleading for. He turned to her, his dark eyes blazing, the force of his stare so violent that it was only then that she realized she ought to have been grateful he'd been pretending to examine his fingernails. She took a step back. Anyone would have when faced with Anthony Bridgerton in such a fury. But when he spoke, his voice was even and controlled. You've made yourself a rather messy little bed here, he said, his cadence slow and precise. I'm afraid you're going to have to lie in it. You would have me marry a man I don't know, she whispered. Is that even the truth? Anthony responded, because you seem to know him very well indeed in the dining room. You certainly leapt to his defense at every conceivable opportunity. Anthony was talking her into a corner, and it was driving her mad. It's not enough for marriage, she insisted. At least not yet, but Anthony wasn't the sort to let up. If not now, then when? 1 week? 2? Stop, she burst out, wanting to throw her hands over her ears. I can't think. You don't think, he corrected. If you'd taken 1 moment to think, to use that tiny portion of your brain reserved for common sense, you would never have run off. She crossed her arms, looking away. She had no argument, and it was killing her. What are you going to do, Eloise? Anthony asked. I don't know, she muttered, hating how stupid she sounded. Well, he said, still continuing in that awful, reasonable voice, that puts us in a bit of a bind, doesn't it? Can't you just say it? She asked, her fists clenching against her rib cage. Do you have to end everything with a question? He smiled humorlessly. And here I thought you'd appreciate my soliciting your opinion. You're being condescending, and you know it. He leaned forward, thunder in his eyes. Do you have any idea how much effort it requires to keep my temper in check? Eloise thought it best not to hazard a guess. You ran off in the middle of the night, he said, rising to his feet, without a word, without even a note. I left a note, she burst out. He looked at her with patent disbelief. I did, she insisted. I left it on the side table in the front hall. Right next to the Chinese vase. And this mysterious note said. It said not to worry, that I was fine and would contact you all within a month. Ah, Anthony said mockingly. That would have set my mind at ease. I don't know why you didn't get it, Eloise muttered. It probably got mixed up with a pile of invitations. For all we knew, Anthony continued, taking a step toward her, you'd been kidnapped. Eloise paled. She'd never even considered that her family might think such a thing. It had never occurred to her that her note might go astray. Do you know what Mother did? Anthony asked, his voice deathly serious. After nearly collapsing with worry? Eloise shook her head, dreading the answer. She went to the bank, Anthony continued. Do you know why? Could you just tell me? Eloise asked wearily. She hated the questions. She went there, he said, walking toward her in a terrifying manner, to make sure that all her funds were in the proper order so that she could withdraw them should she need to ransom you. Eloise shrank back at the fury in her older brother's voice. I left a note, she wanted to say again, but she knew it would come out the wrong way. She'd been wrong, and she'd been foolish, and she didn't want to compound her stupidity by trying to excuse it. Penelope was the one who finally figured out what you'd done, Anthony said. We asked her to search your room, since she's probably spent more time there than any of the rest of us. Eloise nodded. Penelope had been her closest friend, still was, in fact, even though she'd married Colin. They'd spent countless hours up in her room, talking about anything and everything. Philip's letters were the only secret Eloise had ever kept from her. Where did she find the letter? Eloise asked. Not that it mattered, but she couldn't help her curiosity. It had fallen behind your desk. Anthony crossed his arms. Along with a pressed flower. Somehow that seemed fitting. He's a botanist, she whispered. I beg your pardon? A botanist, she said, more loudly this time. Sir Philip. He took a first at Cambridge. He would have been an academic if his brother hadn't died at Waterloo. Anthony nodded, digesting that fact, and the fact that she knew it. If you tell me that he's a cruel man, that he will beat you, that he will insult you and demean you, I will not force your hand. But before you speak, I want you to consider my words. You are a Bridgerton. I don't care who you marry or what your name becomes when you stand up before a priest and say your vows. You will always be a Bridgerton, and we behave with honor and honesty, not because it is expected of us, but because that is what we are. Eloise nodded, swallowing as she fought the tears that were stinging in her eyes. So I will ask you right now, he said. Is there any reason you cannot marry Sir Philip Crane? No, she whispered. She didn't even hesitate. She wasn't ready for this, wasn't yet ready for the marriage, but she wouldn't sully the truth by hesitating on her answer. I thought not. She stood still, almost deflated, not certain what to do or say next. She turned, aware that Anthony had to know she was crying, but not wanting him to see her tears, nonetheless. "I'll marry him," she said, choking on the words. "It's just that I'd wanted." He held silent for a moment, respecting her distress, but then, when she did not continue, he asked, "What did you want, Eloise?" "I'd hoped for a love match," she said, so softly she barely heard herself. "I see," he said, his hearing superb as always. "You should have thought of that before you ran off, shouldn't you?" She hated him in that moment. "You have a love match. You should understand." He said, the tone of his voice indicating that he did not appreciate her trying to make the conversation about him. "Married my wife after we were caught in a compromising position by the biggest bloody gossip in England." Eloise let out a long breath, feeling stupid. It had been so many years since Anthony had married. She'd forgotten the circumstances. "I didn't love my wife when I married her," he continued, "or," he added, his voice growing a bit softer, more gruff and nostalgic, "if I did not yet realize it." Eloise nodded. "You were very lucky," she said, wishing she knew if she could be that lucky with Philip. And then Anthony surprised her, because he didn't scold, and he didn't reprimand. All he said was, "I know." "I felt lost," she whispered. "When Penelope and Colin married." She sank into a chair, letting her head drop into her hands. "I'm a terrible person. I must be a terrible person, horrible and shallow, because when they married, all I could think about was myself." Anthony sighed, and he crouched beside her. "You're not a terrible person, Eloise. You know that." She looked up at him, wondering when it was that this man, her brother, had become so wise. If he'd yelled one more word, spent one more minute speaking to her in that mocking voice, she would have broke. She would have broke, or she would have hardened, but either way, something between them would have been ruined. But here he was, Anthony of all people, who was arrogant and proud and every inch the arch-nobleman he'd been born to be, kneeling at her side, placing his hand on hers, and speaking with a kindness that nearly broke her heart. "I was happy for them," she said. "I am happy for them. I know you are. I should have felt nothing but joy. If you had, you wouldn't be human. Penelope became my sister," she said. "I should have been happy." "Didn't you say that you were?" She nodded. I am. I know that I am. I'm not just saying it." He smiled benignly and waited for her to continue. "It's just that I suddenly felt so lonely, and so old." She looked up at him, wondering if he could possibly understand. "I never thought I would be left behind." He chuckled. "Eloise Bridgerton, I don't think anyone would ever make the mistake of leaving you behind." She felt her lips curve into a wobbly smile, marveling that her brother of all people could actually say the exact right thing. "I suppose I never really thought I'd always be a spinster," she said. "Or, if I was, then at least that Penelope would always be one, too. It wasn't very kind of me, and I don't even think I really thought about it much, but that's just how it was," he said, doing her the kindness of finishing the sentiment. "I don't think even Penelope ever thought she'd marry. And to be honest, I doubt Colin did either. Love can rather creep up on a person, you know." She nodded, wondering if it could creep up on her. Probably not. She was the sort of person who would need it whacked over the head. "I'm glad they're married," Eloise said. "I know you are. I am, too. Sir Philip," she said, motioning toward the door, even though he was actually down the hall and around two corners in the dining room. "We had been corresponding for over a year. And then he mentioned marriage. And he did it in such a sensible manner. He didn't propose, he just inquired if I might like to visit, to see if we would suit. I told myself he was mad, that I couldn't even consider such an offer. Who would marry someone she didn't know?" She let out a shaky little laugh. "And then Colin and Penelope announced their engagement. It was as if my entire world flipped sideways, and that was when I started thinking about it. Every time I looked at my desk, at the drawer where I kept his letters, it was as if they were burning a hole right through the wood." Anthony said nothing, just squeezed her hand, as if he understood. I had to do something, she said. I couldn't just sit and wait for life to happen to me any longer. A chuckle burst from her brother's throat. Eloise, he said, that is the last thing I would ever worry about on your behalf. No, let me finish, he said. You're one of the special ones, Eloise. Life never happens to you. Trust me on this. I've watched you grow up, had to be your father at times when I wanted only to be your brother. Her lips parted as something squeezed around her heart. He was right. He had been a father to her. It was a role neither of them had wanted for him, but he had done it for years, without complaint. And this time she squeezed his hand, not because she loved him, but because it was only now that she realized how very much she did. You happen to life, Eloise, Anthony said. You've always made your own decisions, always been in control. It might not always feel that way, but it's true. She closed her eyes for a moment, shaking her head as she said, well, I was trying to make my own decisions when I came here. It seemed a good plan, and maybe, Anthony said quietly, you'll find that it was indeed a good plan. Sir Philip seems an honorable sort. Eloise couldn't hide her peevish expression. You were able to deduce this while you had your hands wrapped around his throat. He shot her a superior look. You'd be surprised what men can deduce about one another while fighting. You call that fighting? It was 4 against 1. He shrugged. I never said it was fair fighting. You're incorrigible. An interesting adjective, considering your recent activities. Eloise felt herself flush. Very well, Anthony said, his brisk tone signaling a change of topic. Here's what we are going to do. And Eloise knew that whatever he said, it was what she'd be doing. His voice was that resolute. You will pack your bags immediately, Anthony said, and we will all travel to my cottage and remain there for a week. Eloise nodded. My cottage was the rather odd name of Benedict's home, situated not too far from Romney Hall in Wiltshire. He lived there with his wife Sophie and their 3 sons. It wasn't a particularly large home, but it was comfortable, and there was certainly enough room for a few extra Bridgertons. Your Sir Philip may come visit each day, Anthony continued, and Eloise understood his words perfectly to mean, your Sir Philip will come visit each day. She nodded again. If, at the end of the week, I determine that he is good enough to marry my sister, you will do so. Immediately. You're certain you can judge the measure of a man's character in 1 week? It rarely takes longer, Anthony stated. And if I'm unsure, we'll merely wait another se'nnight. Sir Philip might not care to marry me, Eloise felt compelled to point out. Anthony leveled a hard stare at her face. He hasn't that option. Eloise gulped. One of Anthony's brows rose into an arrogant arch. Do we understand each other? She nodded. His plan seemed reasonable, more reasonable, in fact, man most older brothers would have allowed, and if something went horribly wrong, if she decided that she couldn't possibly marry Sir Philip Crane, well then, she had a week to figure out how to get out of it. A lot could happen in a week, just look at the last one. Shall we return to the dining room? Anthony queried. I imagine you're hungry, and if we tarry much longer, Colin is sure to have eaten our host out of house and home. Eloise nodded. Either that, or they've all killed him by now. Anthony paused to consider that. It would save me the expense of a wedding. Anthony. It's a joke, Eloise, he said, giving his head a weary shake. Come along, now. Let's make sure your Sir Philip still resides among the ranks of the living. Asterisk. And then Benedict was saying as Anthony and Eloise re-entered the dining room, the tavern wench arrived and she had the biggest. Benedict! Eloise exclaimed. Benedict looked over at his sister with a supremely guilty expression, yanked back his hands, which were demonstrating the size of what was clearly an impossibly endowed female, and muttered, sorry. You're married, Eloise scolded. But not blind, Colin said with a grin. You're married, too, she accused. But not blind, he said again. Eloise, Gregory said with what was quite possibly the most annoying use of condescension she'd ever had cause to hear, there are some things that are impossible not to see. Especially, he added, when you're a man. It's true, admitted Anthony. I saw it myself. Eloise gasped as she looked from brother to brother, looking for some sane spot in this cesspool of madness. Her eyes fell on Philip, who, by the looks of him, not to mention his slightly inebriated state, had formed a lifelong bond with her brothers during the short time she'd been closeted away with Anthony. Sir Philip? She asked, waiting for him to say something acceptable. But he just offered her a loopy grin. I know who they're talking about, he said, been to that in any number of times. Lucy's quite famous in these parts. Even I've heard of her, Benedict said, with a knowing nod. I'm only an hour away on horseback. Less, if you push hard. Gregory leaned toward Philip, his blue eyes gleaming with interest as he asked, So, did you? Ever? Gregory. Eloise practically yelled. This was really too much. Her brothers should never have been talking about such things in front of her, but even more, the last thing she wanted to know was whether Sir Philip had tupped a tavern wench with bosoms the size of soup tureens. But Philip just shook his head. She's married, he said. As was I. Anthony turned to Eloise and whispered in her ear, He'll do. I'm glad you have such high standards for your beloved sister, she muttered. I told you, Anthony remarked, I've seen Lucy. This is a man with restraint. She planted her hands on her hips and looked her older brother squarely in the eye. Were you tempted? Of course not, Kate would slit my throat. I'm not talking about what Kate would do to you if you strayed, although I'm of the opinion that she would not start at your throat. Anthony winced. He knew it was true. I want to know if you were tempted. No, he admitted, shaking his head, but don't tell anyone. I used to be considered something of a rake, after all. Wouldn't want people to think I was completely tamed. You're appalling. He grinned. And yet, my wife still loves me to distraction, which is all that really matters, isn't it? Eloise supposed he was right. She sighed. What are we going to do about them? She motioned to the quartet of men sitting around the dining room table, which was littered with empty dishes. Philip, Benedict, and Gregory were sitting back and relaxing, looking quite sated. Colin was still eating. Anthony shrugged. I don't know what you want to do, but I'm going to join them. Eloise just stood in the doorway, watching as he sat down and poured himself a glass of wine. The conversation had thankfully moved on from Lucy and her tremendous bosoms, and now they were talking about boxing. Or at least that's what she assumed they were talking about. Philip was demonstrating some sort of hand maneuver to Gregory. Then he punched him in the face. So sorry, Philip said, patting Gregory on the back, but Eloise noticed that the right corner of his mouth was curving ever so slightly into a smile. Won't hurt for long, I'm sure. My chin's feeling better already. Gregory grunted something that was clearly meant to mean that it didn't hurt, but he rubbed his chin nonetheless. Sir Philip? Eloise said loudly. Might I have a word? Of course, he said, standing up immediately, although in all truth, all of the men should have been standing, since she'd never vacated her position in the doorway. Philip walked to her side. Is something amiss? I was worried they were going to kill you, she hissed. Oh. He smiled, that lopsided, 3 glasses of wine sort of smile. They didn't. I see that, she ground out. What happened? He looked back over at the table. Anthony was eating the meager scraps that Colin had left behind, almost certainly only because he hadn't realized they were there, and Benedict was tipping back in his chair, trying to balance it on 2 legs. Gregory was humming to himself, his eyes closed as he smiled beatifically, presumably thinking of Lucy, or, more likely, certain large and squishy parts of Lucy. Philip turned back to her and shrugged. When, Eloise said with exaggerated patience, did you all become the best of friends? Oh, he said, nodding. Funny thing, actually. I asked them to break my legs. Eloise just stared at him. As long as she lived, she'd never understand men. She had 4 brothers, and quite frankly, should have understood them better than most women, and maybe it had taken all of her 28 years to come to this realization, but men were, quite simply, freaks. Philip shrugged again. It seemed to break the ice. Clearly she stared at him, and he stared at her, and all the while she could see Anthony staring at them both, and then suddenly Philip seemed to sober. "We'll have to marry," he said. "I know. They really will break my legs if I don't." "That's not all they would do," she grumbled, "but even so, a lady might like to think she's been chosen for a reason other than osteopathic health." He blinked at her in surprise. "I'm not stupid," she muttered. "I've studied Latin." "Right," he said slowly, "in that way men do when they are trying to cover up the fact that they're not sure what to say." Or at least, she tried desperately, searching for something that might be even loosely interpreted as a compliment, if not a reason other, then perhaps a reason in addition. "Right," he said, nodding, but still not saying anything more. Her eyes narrowed. "How much wine have you drunk?" "Only 3. He stopped, considered that. "Maybe 4. Glasses or bottles?" He didn't seem to know the answer to that. Eloise looked over at the table. There were 4 bottles of wine littered among the remains of supper. 3 were empty. "I wasn't gone that long," she said. He shrugged. "It was either drink with them or let them break my legs." It seemed a fairly straightforward decision. "Anthony," she called out. She'd had enough of Philip. She'd had enough of them all, of everything, of men, of marriage, of broken legs and empty wine bottles. But most of all, she'd had enough of herself, of feeling so out of control, so helpless against the tides of her life. "I want to go," she said. Anthony nodded and grunted, still chewing the solitary piece of chicken that Colin had missed. "Now, Anthony." And he must have heard the crack in her voice, the hollow note that choked on the syllables, because he stood immediately and said, "Of course." Eloise had never been so glad to see the inside of a carriage in all her life. Chapter 11. Cannot abide a man who drinks to excess. Which is why I'm sure you will understand why I could not accept Lord Westcott's offer. From Eloise Bridgerton to her brother Benedict, upon refusing her second proposal of marriage. "No," gushed Sophie Bridgerton, Benedict's petite and almost ethereal-looking wife. "They didn't." "They did," Eloise said grimly, as she sat back in her lawn chair and sipped a cup of lemonade. "And then they all got drunk." "Fiends," Sophie muttered, leading Eloise to realize that what she'd really been sick of the night before was that horribly chummish and collegial manner of men. Clearly, all she'd needed was one sensible female with whom she might disparage the lot of them. Sophie scowled. "Don't tell me they were talking about that poor Lucy woman again." Eloise gasped. "You know about her?" "Everyone knows about her. Heaven knows. One can't miss her if you pass in the street." Eloise stopped, thought, tried to imagine. She couldn't. "Truth be told," Sophie said, whispering under her breath even though there wasn't a soul nearby who might hear, "I feel sorry for the woman. All that unwanted attention, and, well, it can't be good for her back." Eloise tried to stifle her laugh, but a little snort made it through. "Posy once even asked her about it." Eloise's mouth fell open. Posy was Sophie's stepsister, who had lived for several years with the Bridgertons before marrying the rather jolly vicar who lived just 5 miles from Benedict and Sophie. She was also, quite honestly, the friendliest person of Eloise's acquaintance, and if anyone was going to befriend a married serving wench with large bosoms, it would have been her. "She's in Hughes Parish," Sophie explained, referring to Posy's husband. So of course they would have met. "What did she say?" Eloise asked. "Posy?" "No. Lucy." "Oh. I don't know." Sophie pulled a face. "Posy wouldn't tell me." "Can you believe that? I don't think Posy has kept a secret from me in all her life. She said she couldn't betray the confidence of a parishioner." Eloise thought that rather noble of Posy. It doesn't concern me, of course, Sophie said, with all the confidence of a woman who knows she is loved. Benedict would never stray. Of course not, Eloise said quickly. Benedict and Sophie's love story was legendary in their family. It had been one of the reasons Eloise had refused so many proposals of marriage. She'd wanted that kind of love and passion and drama. She'd wanted more than, I have 3 homes, 16 horses, and 42 hounds, which is what one of her suitors had informed her when he asked for her hand. But, Sophie continued, I don't think it's so much to ask that he managed to keep his mouth closed when she walks by. Eloise was about to offer her firm and vehement agreement when she saw Sir Philip walking across the lawn in her direction. Is that him? Sophie asked, smiling. Eloise nodded. He's very handsome. Yes, I suppose, Eloise said slowly. You suppose? Sophie snorted with impatience. Don't play coy with me, Eloise Bridgerton. I was once your lady's maid, and I know you better than anyone ought. Eloise forbore to point out that Sophie had been her lady's maid for all of 2 weeks before she and Benedict had come to their senses and decided to marry. Very well, she allowed, he's quite handsome, if you like the rough, rural sort. Which you do, Sophie said pertly. To her complete mortification, Eloise felt herself blush. Perhaps, she muttered. And, Sophie said approvingly, he brought flowers. He's a botanist, Eloise said. That doesn't make the gesture any less sweet. No, just easier. Eloise, Sophie said disapprovingly, stop this right now. Stop what? Trying to cut the poor man down before he even has a chance. That's not what I was doing at all, Eloise protested, but she knew she was lying the moment the words left her lips. She hated that her family was trying to run her life, no matter how well-intentioned they were, and it had left her feeling sullen and uncooperative. Well, I think the flowers are very sweet, Sophie declared firmly. I don't care if he had 8,000 different varieties available to him. He still thought to bring them. Eloise nodded, hating herself. She wanted to feel better, wanted to be all smiles and cheer and optimism, but she just couldn't manage it. Benedict didn't give me all the details, Sophie continued, ignoring Eloise's distress. You know how men are. They never tell you what you want to know. What do you want to know? Sophie looked over at Sir Philip, gauging how long she'd have before he reached their side. Well, for one thing, is it true you'd not met him before you ran off? Not face to face, no, Eloise admitted. It all sounded so stupid when she recounted the tale. Who would have thought that she, a Bridgerton, would run away to a man she'd never met? Well, Sophie said, her voice matter of fact, if it all works out in the end, what a romantic tale it will be. Eloise swallowed uncomfortably. It was still too soon to know if it would all work out in the end. She rather suspected no. In truth, she was quite certain that she'd find herself married to Sir Philip, but who knew what sort of marriage it would be? She didn't love him, not yet, anyway, and he didn't love her, and she'd thought that would be all right, but now that she was here in Wiltshire, trying not to notice how Benedict looked at Sophie, she was wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. And did she really want to wed a man who was looking primarily for a mother for his children? If one didn't have love, was it better, then, to be alone? Unfortunately, the only way to answer these questions was to marry Sir Philip and see how it went. And if it didn't go well, she'd be stuck. The easiest way out of marriage was death, and frankly, that wasn't something Eloise cared to contemplate. Miss Bridgerton, Philip was standing in front of her, holding out a bouquet of white orchids. I brought these for you. She smiled at him, heartened by the slightly nervous, giddy feeling that arose within her at his appearance. Thank you, she murmured, taking them and smelling the blooms. They're lovely. Wherever did you find orchids? Sophie asked. They're exquisite. I grew them, he answered. I keep a greenhouse. Yes, of course, Sophie said. Eloise mentioned that you are a botanist. I do like to garden myself. Although I must say that most of the time I haven't the least idea what I'm doing. Our caretakers here consider me the bane of their existence, I'm sure. Eloise cleared her throat, aware that she had not yet made introductions. Sir Philip, she said, motioning to her sister-in-law. This is Benedict's wife Sophie. He bowed over her hand, murmuring, Mrs. Bridgerton. I'm very pleased to meet you, Sophie said in her most friendly manner. And please, do use my Christian name. I'm told you already do so with Eloise, and furthermore, it sounds as if you are practically a member of the family already. Eloise flushed. Oh! Sophie exclaimed, instantly embarrassed. I did not mean that in relation to you, Eloise. I would never assume, oh, dear. What I meant to say was that I meant it because the men. Her cheeks turned a deep red as she looked down at her hands. Well, she mumbled, I'd heard there was a great deal of wine. Philip cleared his throat. A detail I'd prefer not to remember. The fact that you remember at all is remarkable, Eloise said sweetly. He looked over at her, his expression clearly indicating that he had not been taken in by her sugary tone. You're too kind. Does your head ache? She asked. He winced. Like the devil, she should have been concerned. She should have been kind, especially since he'd gone to the trouble of bringing her rare orchids. But she couldn't help feeling it was no more than he deserved, so she said, quietly, but still said it, good. Eloise. Sophie said disapprovingly, how is Benedict feeling? Eloise asked her sweetly. Sophie sighed. He's been a bear all morning, and Gregory hasn't even risen from bed. I seem to have fared well by comparison, then, Philip said. Except for Colin, Eloise told him. He never feels the after-effects of alcohol, and of course Anthony drank little last night. Lucky man. Would you care for something to drink, Sir Philip? Sophie asked, adjusting her bonnet so that it better shaded her eyes. Of the benign, non-intoxicating variety, of course, given the circumstances. I would be happy to have someone bring you a glass of lemonade. That would be most appreciated. Thank you. He watched as she rose and walked up the slight incline to the house, then sat in her place across from Eloise. It is good to see you this morning, he said, clearing his throat. He was never the most talkative of men, and he was clearly making no exceptions this morning, despite the rather extraordinary circumstances that had led to this moment. And you, she murmured. He shifted in his seat. It was too small for him, most chairs were. I must apologize for my behavior last night, he said stiffly. She looked over at him, staring into his dark eyes for just a moment before her gaze slid down to a patch of grass beside him. He seemed sincere, he probably was. She didn't know him well, certainly not well enough to marry, although it seemed that point was now moot, but he didn't seem the sort to make false apologies. Still, she wasn't quite ready to fall all over him with gratitude, so when she answered, she did so in a sparing fashion. I have brothers, she said. I am used to it. Perhaps, but I am not. I assure you I do not make a habit of over-imbibing. She nodded, accepting his apology. I have been thinking, he said. As have I. He cleared his throat, then tugged at his cravat, as if it had suddenly grown too tight. We will, of course, have to marry. It was nothing more than she knew, but there was something awful in the way he said it. Maybe it was the lack of emotion in his voice, as if she were a problem he had to solve. Or maybe it was the way he said it so matter-of-factly, as if she had no choice, which, in truth, she did not, but she didn't care to be reminded of that. Whatever it was, it made her feel strange, and itchy, as if she needed to jump out of her skin. She had spent her adult life making her own choices, had considered herself the luckiest of females, because her family had allowed her to do so. Maybe that was why it now felt so unbearable to be forced onto a path before she was ready. Or maybe it was unbearable, because she was the one who had set this entire farce into motion. She was furious with herself, and it was making her snippy with everyone. I'll do my best to make you happy, he said gruffly. And the children need a mother. She smiled weakly. She'd wanted her marriage to be about more than just children. I'm sure you'll be a great help, he said. A great help, she echoed, hating the way it sounded. Wouldn't you agree? She nodded, mostly because she was afraid that if she opened her mouth, she might scream. Good, he said. Then it's all settled. It's all settled. For the rest of her life, that would be her grand proposal of marriage. It's all settled, and the worst part of it was she had no right to complain. She was the one who'd run off, without giving Philip enough time to arrange for a chaperone. She was the one who'd been so eager to make her own destiny. She was the one who'd acted without thinking, and now all she had to show for it was. It's all settled. She swallowed. Wonderful. He looked at her, blinking in confusion. Aren't you happy? Of course, she said hollowly. You don't sound happy. I'm happy, she snapped. Philip muttered something under his breath. What did you say? She asked. Nothing. You said something. He gave her an impatient look. If I'd meant for you to hear it, I would have said it out loud. She sucked in her breath. Then you shouldn't have said it at all. Some things, Philip muttered, are impossible to keep inside. What did you say? She demanded. Philip raked his hand through his hair. Eloise. Did you insult me? Do you really want to know? Since it appears we are to be wed, she bit off, yes. I don't recall my exact words, Philip shot back, but I believe I may have uttered the words women and lack of sense in the same breath. He shouldn't have said it. He knew he shouldn't have said it. It would have been rude under any circumstances, and it was especially wrong right now, but she had pushed and pushed and pushed and wouldn't back down. It was like she'd sliced a needle under his skin, and then decided to jab just for the fun of it. And besides, why was she in such a terrible mood, anyway? All he'd done was state the facts. They would have to marry, and frankly, she should have been glad that if she'd been compromised, at least it had been with a man who was willing to do the right thing and wed her. He didn't expect gratitude. Hell, this was as much his fault as it was hers. He was the one who'd issued the initial invitation, after all. But was it too much to expect a smile and a pleasant mood? I'm glad we had this conversation, Eloise said, quite suddenly. This has been good. He looked up, instantly suspicious. I beg your pardon. Very beneficial, she said. One should always understand one's spouse before one marries, and... He groaned. This was not going to end well. And, she added sharply, glaring at his groan, it is certainly provident that I now know how you feel about my gender. He was the sort who usually walked away from conflict, but really, this was too much. If I recall correctly, he shot back, I never did tell you exactly what I thought of women. I inferred it, she retorted. The phrase lack of sense pointed me in the correct direction. Did it? He drawled. Well, I'm thinking differently now. Her eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I mean that I've changed my mind. I've decided I don't have difficulties with women in general, after all. It's you I find insufferable. She drew back, clearly affronted. Has no one called you insufferable before? He found that difficult to believe. No one who wasn't related to me, she grumbled. You must live in a very polite society. He squirmed in his seat again. Really, did no one make chairs for large men anymore? Either that, he muttered, or you've simply terrified everyone into bending to your every whim. She flushed, and he couldn't tell if it was because she was embarrassed by his spot-on assessment of her personality, or just because she was angry beyond words. Probably both. I'm sorry, she muttered. He turned to her in surprise. I beg your pardon? He couldn't have heard correctly. I said I'm sorry, she repeated, making it clear that she was not going to say the words a third time, so he'd better be listening well. Oh, he said, too stunned to say much of anything else. Thank you. You're welcome. Her tone was less than gracious, but she seemed to be trying hard, nonetheless. For a moment he said nothing. Then he had to ask. What for? She looked up, obviously irritated that hadn't been the end of it. Did you have to ask? She grumbled. Well, yes. I am sorry, she ground out, because I am in a horrid mood and have been behaving badly. And if you ask how I have been behaving badly, I swear I will get up and walk away and you will never see me again, because I assure you, this apology is difficult enough without my having to explain it further. Philip decided he couldn't possibly hope for more. Thank you, he said softly. He held his tongue for a minute, quite possibly the longest minute of his life. Then he decided he might as well just go ahead and say it. If it makes you feel any better, he told her, I had decided we would suit before your brothers arrived. I was already planning to ask you to be my wife. Properly, with a ring and whatever else it is I'm supposed to do, I don't know. It's been a long while since I proposed marriage to anyone, and last time wasn't under normal circumstances in any case. She looked up at him, surprise in her eyes, and perhaps a little bit of gratitude as well. I'm sorry that your brothers came along and made it all happen faster than you are ready for, he added, but I'm not sorry that it's happening. You're not, she whispered. Really? I'll give you as long as you need, he said, within reason, of course. But I cannot. He glanced up the hill. Anthony and Colin were ambling down toward them, followed by a footman carrying a tray of food. I cannot speak for your brothers. I dare say they won't care to wait as long you might prefer. And quite frankly, if you were my sister, I'd have marched you to a church last night. She looked up the hill at her brothers, they were still at least a half a minute away. She opened her mouth, then closed it in. Obvious thought. Finally, after several seconds, during which he could practically see the wheels of her mind churning and turning, she blurted out, Why did you decide we would suit? I beg your pardon? It was a stalling tactic, of course. He hadn't expected such a direct question. Although heaven knew why not. This was Eloise, after all. Why did you decide we would suit? She repeated, her voice pointed and undeniable, but of course that would be how she would ask it. There was nothing subtle or deniable about Eloise Bridgerton. She would never skirt around an issue when she could just walk right in and stick her nose directly into the heart of the matter. He coughed, cleared his throat. You don't know, she stated, sounding disappointed. Of course I know, he protested. No man liked to be told he didn't know his own mind. No, you don't. If you did, you wouldn't be sitting there choking on air. Good God, woman, do you have a charitable bone in your body? A man needs time to formulate an answer. Came Colin Bridgerton's ever-genial voice. Here's the happy couple. Philip had never been so glad to see another human being in all his life. Good morning, he said to the two Bridgerton men, inordinately pleased to have escaped Eloise's interrogation. Hungry? Colin inquired as he sat in the chair next to Philip. I took the liberty of having the kitchen prepare breakfast al fresco. Philip looked over at the footman and wondered if he ought to offer to help. The poor man looked nearly ready to collapse under the weight of the food. How are you this morning? Anthony asked as he sat down on the cushioned bench next to Eloise. Fine, she replied. Hungry? No. Cheerful? Not for you. Anthony turned to Philip. She's usually more conversational. Philip wondered if Eloise would hit him. It wouldn't be more than he deserved. The tray of food came down on the table with a loud clatter, followed by the footman's abject apology for being so clumsy, followed by Anthony's assurance that it was no trouble at all, that Hercules himself could not carry enough food to suit Colin. The two Bridgerton brothers served themselves. Then Anthony turned to Eloise and Philip and said, The two of you certainly seem well suited this morning. Eloise looked at him with open hostility. When did you reach that conclusion? It only took a moment, he said with a shrug. He looked at Philip. It was the bickering, actually. All the best couples do it. I'm glad to hear it, Philip murmured. My wife and I often have similar conversations before she comes around to my way of thinking, Anthony said affably. Eloise shot him a peevish expression. Of course, my wife might offer a different interpretation, he added with a shrug. I allow her to think that I'm coming round to her way of thinking. He turned back to Philip and smiled. It's easier that way. Philip stole a glance at Eloise. She appeared to be working very hard to hold her tongue. When did you arrive? Anthony asked him. Just a few minutes ago, he replied. Yes, Eloise said. He proposed marriage, I'm sure you'll be happy to hear. Philip coughed with surprise at her sudden announcement. I beg your pardon? Eloise turned to Anthony. He said, we'll have to marry. Well, he's right. Anthony replied, settling a level stare directly on her face. You do have to marry. And my compliments to him for not beating around the bush about it. I think you of all people would appreciate direct conversation. Scone, anyone? Colin asked. No? More for me, then. Anthony turned to Philip and said, she's just a bit irritated because she hates being ordered about. She'll be fine in a few days. I'm fine right now, Eloise ground out. Yes, Anthony murmured, you look fine. Don't you have somewhere to be? Eloise asked. Through her teeth. An interesting question, her brother replied. One might say that I ought to be in London, with my wife and children. In fact, if I did have somewhere else to be, I imagine that would be it. But strangely enough, I seem to be here. In Wiltshire. Where, when I woke in my comfortable bed in London 3 days ago, I would never have guessed I would be. He smiled blandly. Any other questions? She was quiet at that. Anthony handed an envelope to Eloise. This arrived for you. She looked down, and Philip could see that she instantly recognized the handwriting. It's from Mother, Anthony said, even though it was clear she already knew that. Do you want to read it? Philip asked. She shook her head. Not now. Which meant, he realized, not in front of her brothers, and then suddenly he knew what he had to do. Lord Bridgerton, he said to Anthony, standing up, might I request a moment alone with your sister? You just had a moment alone with her, Colin said, between bites of bacon. Philip ignored him. My lord? Of course, Anthony said, if she's agreeable. Philip grabbed Eloise's hand and yanked her to her feet. She's agreeable, he said. Colin remarked. She looks very agreeable. Philip decided then and there that all the Bridgertons ought to be fitted with muzzles. Come with me, he said to Eloise, before she had a chance to argue. Which of course she would, since she was Eloise, and she would never smile politely and follow when an argument was a possibility. Where are we going? She gasped, once he had pulled her away from her family and was striding across the lawn, unmindful of how she had to run to keep up. I don't know. You don't know? He stopped so quickly that she crashed into him. It was rather nice, actually. He could feel every last bit of her, from her breasts to her thighs, although she recovered all too quickly and stepped away before he could savor the moment. I've never been here before, he said, explaining it to her as if she were a small child. I'd have to be a bloody clairvoyant to know where I'm going. Oh, she said. Well then, lead the way. He pulled her back to the house, making his way to a side door. Where does this go? He asked. Inside, she replied. He gave her a sarcastic look. Through Sophie's writing room to the hall, Eloise expounded. Is Sophie in her writing room? I doubt it. Didn't she go to fetch you lemonade? Good. He pulled the door open, muttering a quick thanks that it was unlocked, and poked his head inside. The room was empty, but the door to the hall was open, so he strode across and pulled it shut. When he turned back around, Eloise was still standing in the open doorway to the outside, watching him with a blend of curiosity and amusement. Shut the door, he ordered. Her brows rose. I beg your pardon? Shut it. It wasn't a tone of voice he used often, But after a year of floating along, a feeling lost amid the currents of his life, he was finally taking control. And he knew exactly what he wanted. "Shut the door, Eloise," he said in a low voice, moving slowly across the room toward her. Her eyes widened. "Philip," she whispered. "Don't talk," he said, "just shut the door." But she was frozen in place, staring at him as if she didn't know him. Which, in truth, she didn't. Hell, he wasn't so sure he